The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled to a slow, dusty stop at the edge of the frontier town. A thin cloud of dirt rose into the hot afternoon air, clinging to everything, the wooden storefronts, the hitching posts, the boots of the men who had gathered to watch. News traveled fast in a place like this, and today's entertainment had arrived right on schedule. Inside the wagon, the young woman sat perfectly still, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The journey had taken weeks, long, rattling days under the sun and cold, restless nights beneath unfamiliar stars. Every mile had carried her farther from the only life she had ever known and closer to a future she had built entirely on hope. A husband. A home. A chance to belong. She swallowed, steadying her breath, before reaching for the small, worn suitcase at her feet. It held everything she owned, 2 dresses, a pair of shoes, and a folded letter she had read so many times she knew every word by heart. That letter had promised kindness. Stability. A new beginning. The driver cleared his throat. "We're here." The word struck her harder than she expected. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, gathering what little courage she had left, she pushed open the wagon door and stepped down. The sunlight hit her eyes, sharp and unforgiving. Shapes came into focus slowly, the line of buildings, the scattered horses, and the crowd. There were more people than she imagined. Men leaned against posts, arms crossed. Women stood in small clusters, whispering behind gloved hands. Even a few children watched with wide, curious eyes. Heat rushed to her face. This wasn't how she imagined it. She had pictured something quieter. Private. Perhaps even warm. Instead, it felt like she had stepped onto a stage. Her boots touched the ground, unsteady after so many days of travel. She adjusted her dress nervously, smoothing invisible creases, and lifted her chin just enough to search the crowd. Then she saw him. He stood near the center, slightly apart from the others, dressed in clean but simple ranch clothes. Taller than most, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hard set of his jaw. This was the man she had crossed half a country to meet. Her husband. Or so she thought. A flicker of relief passed through her chest. At least he had come. She took a hesitant step forward. But before she could speak, his eyes swept over her, slowly, deliberately. Not with curiosity. Not with warmth. With judgment. The air seemed to shift. He frowned. Not a small, uncertain frown. A deep, visible displeasure that tightened his entire expression. "This isn't right," he said. The words weren't loud, but in the stillness of the crowd, they carried. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The young woman blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Sir," she began, her voice soft from disuse and nerves. He didn't answer her. Instead, he turned slightly, addressing the crowd as much as her. "This isn't the woman I ordered." The sentence landed like a slap. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the whispers. "She don't look like the description. Too plain, I reckon. Poor thing." Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles turned pale. I believe there must be some mistake," she said quickly, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Your letter, your name, everything matches. I came as requested." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Well, you came," he said. "That much is true." A few men in the crowd chuckled under their breath. Her chest tightened. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the faint lines of irritation etched into his face. "But I've already made another arrangement," he continued. "Someone more, suitable." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Her stomach dropped. Another arrangement? She glanced around, confusion clouding her thoughts, until she noticed a woman standing near the porch of the general store. Dressed in brighter fabric, her posture confident, her expression faintly smug. Understanding came slowly, and then all at once. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady. You replaced me," she whispered. "I corrected a mistake," he replied bluntly. A ripple of laughter spread through part of the crowd, while others looked away, uncomfortable but silent. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself not to cry. "Not here. Not in front of all these people. I have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice barely above a breath. For a brief moment, just a flicker, something like hesitation crossed his face. But it vanished just as quickly. "That isn't my concern," he said. The finality in his tone closed the door on any remaining hope. Silence followed. Heavy. Suffocating. The young woman stood frozen, her suitcase hanging at her side, her future collapsing piece by piece in front of strangers who watched as if it were a show. No home. No husband. No place in this town. Just the long road behind her, and nothing ahead. Slowly, she lowered her gaze to the dust at her feet, gathering what remained of her dignity. If she stayed any longer, she might break completely. So she turned. One step. Then another. Each one heavier than the last. She didn't know where she was going. Only that she couldn't stay. At the edge of the crowd, just beyond the line of watching faces, a lone figure stood apart, silent, still, and unseen by most. But his eyes were fixed on her. Watching. Waiting. And for the first time since she had stepped off the wagon, someone wasn't looking at her with judgment. He was looking at her pain. The crowd remained frozen as the young woman walked away from the wagon, each step carrying the weight of humiliation she never expected to feel. The whispers followed her like a shadow. She should have known better. Imagine traveling all that way just to be refused. Poor girl. Every word cut deeper. She kept her eyes lowered, refusing to let the tears fall. She had already lost her home, her promised future, and the little hope she carried across the miles. She would not give this town the satisfaction of watching her completely break. But what she didn't know was that someone had been watching the entire time. At the far edge of the street, away from the crowd, stood a lone Apache warrior. He had not joined the laughter. He had not whispered with the others. He had simply watched. The warrior was a striking figure against the dusty frontier landscape. His long black hair moved slightly in the warm wind, and simple tribal jewelry rested against his strong frame. His presence was quiet, but there was a strength about him that made even the loudest voices nearby seem smaller. Many in the town knew of him. Some feared him. Some judged him without ever knowing his story. But the Apache warrior had learned long ago that people often feared what they refused to understand. His eyes remained on the woman who had just been rejected in front of everyone. He noticed the way her shoulders trembled. He noticed how tightly she held that small suitcase, as if it was the only thing keeping her connected to the life she had left behind. And he noticed something else. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She was simply hurt. The warrior had seen that kind of pain before. The pain of someone being treated as if they had no voice. The crowd slowly began to move again. Some people returned to their conversations. Others prepared to leave, believing the drama was over. But the Apache warrior did not move. The rejected bride stopped near the edge of town. She looked down the empty road ahead, the same road she had traveled with dreams in her heart. Now it looked endless. Where would she go? Who would help her? The thought frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered to herself, "I should have known better." She blamed herself. That was the cruelest part. She had believed the promises in the letters. She had believed that somewhere beyond the horizon was a place where she mattered. Now she wondered if she had been foolish for hoping. Behind her, the rancher's voice carried through the street. "You should find somewhere else to be," he called. The woman stopped but did not turn around. The same man who had promised her a future was now treating her like an inconvenience. A few people watched, waiting to see what she would do. Would she beg? Would she cry? Would she fight back? But she simply stood there, trying to find enough strength to take another step. That was when the Apache warrior finally moved. One step. Then another. The sound of his boots against the dirt was quiet, but somehow everyone noticed. Conversations faded. Heads turned. The crowd parted slightly as he walked forward. The rancher's expression changed when he saw him approaching. "What do you want?" the rancher asked, trying to sound confident. The Apache warrior stopped several feet away. He did not look at the rancher. He looked at the woman. For a moment, neither spoke. The woman looked up, surprised. She expected pity. She expected curiosity. Maybe even judgment. But she found none of those things. Only calm. Only respect. The warrior finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. "She chooses now." The words were simple. But they changed the entire atmosphere of the street. The crowd went silent. The woman stared at him, confused. The rancher laughed. "Choose," he said mockingly. "She came here because of an arrangement. She has nowhere else to go." The Apache warrior turned his eyes toward him. "She is not a thing you own." The rancher's smile disappeared. No one expected the Apache to challenge him. Not here. Not in front of everyone. The warrior looked back at the woman. "You traveled far," he said quietly. "You were promised a life. But no promise gives another person control over your choice." The woman felt her throat tighten. Nobody had spoken to her that way all day. Everyone had talked about her. Nobody had talked to her. The Apache warrior continued. "You decide where you stand. You decide where you go. You decide what happens next." The woman looked around at the crowd. Minutes earlier, she had felt invisible. Now, for the first time, someone had reminded her that she had a voice. The rancher stepped forward angrily. "This is none of your business." The Apache warrior remained calm. "No," he replied. "Her life is her business." The street became completely silent. Even those who disliked him had nothing to say. Because everyone understood one thing. The woman who arrived in town with no power had just been given something far more valuable than a home. She had been given a choice. And now, all eyes turned toward her. For the first time that day, nobody was deciding her future. They were waiting to hear her decide it herself. The entire town waited. No one spoke. No one moved. The rejected bride stood in the middle of the dusty street, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes watching her. Only moments earlier, those eyes had judged her, pitied her, and whispered about her. Now they waited for her answer. For the first time in her life, the decision belonged completely to her. But freedom was not as simple as it sounded. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. She could feel the rough leather pressing into her palm, reminding her of everything she had carried to this place, her hopes, her fears, and the dream of finally having somewhere to call home. She looked toward the rancher. The man who was supposed to welcome her. The man whose letters had convinced her to leave everything behind. She searched his face for even a small sign of regret. There was none. Only pride. Only irritation. As if her pain was an inconvenience he wished would disappear. Her heart sank. Then she looked back at the Apache warrior. He stood quietly, giving her no command and making no demand. That surprised her more than anything. All day, men had told her what she should do. The rancher had decided she was not good enough. The crowd had decided she was foolish. But this man, the one everyone feared, was the only person who had actually asked what she wanted. The rancher scoffed. "Don't be foolish," he said. You know how this works. You came here to marry me. The bride lowered her eyes. His words sounded familiar. Not because they were kind. Because they were the same words she had heard her entire life. You should obey. You should accept. You should be grateful. She had spent years believing that a woman's happiness depended on being chosen by someone else. But standing there in the dust, abandoned by the very person who claimed to want her, she began to understand something. Being chosen was not the same as being valued. The Apache warrior spoke again, his voice calm. No one decides your worth. The word struck something deep inside her. She looked at him. You don't even know me, she whispered. The warrior nodded. That is true. The honesty caught her off guard. Most people would have tried to convince her. They would have made promises. They would have said whatever they needed to say. But he simply admitted the truth. I do not know your past, he continued. I do not know your dreams. I only know what I saw today. He glanced toward the rancher. I saw someone arrive with hope. Then he looked back at her. And I saw people try to take that hope away. The bride felt tears forming in her eyes. Not tears of shame this time. Something different. Something she could not name. The rancher stepped closer. You would really trust a stranger over the man you came here for? The question was meant to embarrass her. But instead, it made her think. Trust? Had she ever truly trusted him? Or had she only trusted the dream he had written in his letters? She remembered every promise. A warm home. A loving husband. A place where she would finally belong. But those promises had disappeared the moment he saw her. The truth was painful. She had not lost a loving husband today. She had lost an illusion. The bride slowly lifted her head. Her voice was quiet at first. I came here because I believed I had a choice. The rancher frowned. She continued. I believed I was coming to a new life. Not to become someone's possession. A few people in the crowd exchanged looks. The woman who arrived trembling was beginning to disappear. In her place stood someone stronger. The rancher shook his head. You have no idea what you're doing. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Maybe she did not know exactly what came next. Maybe she was still afraid. Maybe the road ahead was uncertain. But she knew one thing. She would rather face an unknown future than return to a place where she was unwanted. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. The town fell silent. She took a deep breath. Then she turned away from the rancher. A gasp moved through the crowd. The rancher's face hardened. You'll regret this. She stopped walking. For a moment, the old fear returned. The fear of being alone. The fear of making the wrong choice. But then she remembered something. She was no longer the frightened woman who stepped off that wagon. Someone had reminded her that her life belonged to her. She turned slightly and answered. I regret trusting someone who never respected me. The words were simple. But they carried the strength of every moment she had spent being ignored. The Apache warrior watched silently. He did not smile. He did not act like he had won something. Because this was never about him winning. It was about her finding herself. The bride walked a few steps forward, then stopped beside him. The crowd watched in disbelief. The rejected woman had made her decision. Not because she was rescued. Not because she needed someone to save her. But because, for the first time, she had been given the freedom to choose. The Apache warrior looked at her and asked softly. Are you certain? She looked back at the road ahead. It was unknown. It was difficult. But it was hers. Yes, she answered. And with those two words, the woman who arrived in town unwanted finally took control of her own destiny. The first night away from the town was quieter than the bride expected. Too quiet. As the small campfire crackled beneath the endless western sky, she sat wrapped in a simple blanket, staring into the flames. The events of the day replayed again and again in her mind. The wagon arriving. The crowd watching. The rancher's cruel words. The moment she thought her entire future had disappeared. She had spent so long believing that a woman's security came from being accepted by someone else. A husband. A family. A home. But now she sat beside a stranger, miles away from the only future she had planned. And strangely, she felt more at peace than she had in weeks. The Apache warrior sat a respectful distance away, quietly tending to the fire. He did not ask endless questions. He did not demand explanations. He did not act as if saving her meant she owed him something. That was what confused her most. Every man she had known had wanted something in return. But this man had given her something without asking for anything. Her freedom. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Why did you help me?" The warrior looked up. The question seemed simple, but he understood the weight behind it. "I did not help you," he answered. She looked surprised. "You didn't?" He shook his head. "No. I reminded you that you could help yourself." The words stayed with her. She looked down at her hands. "I was so sure I was coming here to start a new life." "You still are," he said. She looked toward him. "But everything changed." The warrior nodded. "Sometimes the life we plan is not the life waiting for us." A small smile almost appeared on her face. It was the first peaceful expression she had shown since arriving. Over the next few days, she began to see the world differently. The Apache warrior did not treat her like a fragile person who needed to be protected from everything. Instead, he treated her like someone capable of learning. He showed her how to read the land. How to recognize approaching weather. How to find safe paths through unfamiliar terrain. How to listen before making a decision. At first, she struggled. The open wilderness frightened her. The silence of the land felt overwhelming. She had grown up surrounded by streets, houses, and familiar voices. Now every sound had meaning. The wind. The animals. The movement of the trees. But slowly, fear became curiosity. Curiosity became confidence. One morning, she watched as the warrior prepared the horses. "I want to learn," she said. He looked at her. "To ride?" She nodded. "I don't want to spend my life waiting for someone else to carry me." The warrior studied her for a moment. Then he handed her the reins. "Good." That single word meant more than she expected. There was no doubt in his voice. No laughter. No suggestion that she was too weak. He believed she could do it. The first attempt was not graceful. The horse moved slowly, and she immediately grabbed the saddle in panic. "I'm falling," she said. The warrior walked beside her. "No. You are learning." She looked down at him. "That feels very different." He nodded. "It is." Days turned into weeks. The woman who once walked through a town with her head lowered began to stand taller. She learned to build fires, prepare meals, and travel across the land. But more importantly, she learned to trust her own judgment. The Apache warrior noticed the change. The sadness in her eyes began to fade. The fear in her voice became strength. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, she sat beside him watching the sky turn gold. "I thought being chosen was the greatest thing someone could give me," she said. The warrior looked at her. "And now?" She smiled softly. "Now I think being respected is worth more." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was peaceful. The warrior had saved her from a humiliating moment, but he had done something even greater. He had helped her remember who she was. And she was beginning to realize something about him too. Behind the quiet expression and powerful presence was a man who carried his own wounds. A man who understood loneliness. A man who had spent years standing apart from others because the world had never tried to understand him. They were different in many ways. But they shared one thing. They both knew what it felt like to be judged before being known. As the evening wind moved across the land, the bride looked toward the horizon. For the first time since leaving home, she was not wondering where she belonged. She was building a place where she could belong. Not because someone had chosen her, but because she had finally chosen herself. And beside her stood the one person who never tried to take that choice away. Months had passed since the day the bride stood alone in the middle of the frontier town, holding a suitcase and a broken dream. But the woman who walked away from that town no longer existed. The woman who had once lowered her eyes when people judged her now looked toward the horizon with confidence. She had learned that strength was not always loud. Sometimes strength was simply standing firm when the world expected you to fall. Life with the Apache warrior had not been easy. There were no grand houses. No servants. No comfortable life waiting for her. Instead, there were early mornings, long journeys, and lessons she never imagined she would need to learn. But there was something she had never experienced before. Respect. The Apache warrior never told her what she could or could not do. He never treated her as a burden. He never reminded her that she had nowhere else to go. Every choice was hers. Every step was hers. And slowly, the fear that had followed her from the town began to disappear. One afternoon, she sat outside their small home, repairing a torn piece of cloth. The wind moved gently through the trees as the Apache warrior returned from checking the nearby land. He stopped for a moment, watching her. She noticed him and smiled. "What is it?" He shook his head. "Nothing." She raised an eyebrow. "You were looking at me like you wanted to say something." A small smile appeared on his face. "I was remembering the woman who arrived in that town." She looked down, remembering. "That woman was scared." "Yes," he said. She looked back at him. "And now?" The warrior studied her carefully. "Now she knows she is not helpless." Those words stayed with her. Because they were true. She had not become stronger because someone saved her. She had become stronger because someone finally believed she could. But peace never lasts forever on the frontier. Several days later, the sound of approaching horses broke the quiet morning. The woman looked up. Something about the riders made her uneasy. As they came closer, her heart sank. At the front of the group was the rancher. The same man who had rejected her in front of the entire town. The same man who had told her she was not his concern. But now his expression was different. Less confident. More desperate. The Apache warrior stepped forward immediately, placing himself between the woman and the approaching riders. The rancher stopped his horse. "You've been hiding her away." The woman felt anger rise inside her. Hiding her? That was not what happened. For months, she had finally been living. The Apache warrior remained calm. "She is not hidden." The rancher looked past him. "She belongs with me." The words made the woman's entire body tense. Months ago, those words might have frightened her. Today, they only reminded her of how far she had come. The Apache warrior's expression hardened. "No one belongs to another person." The rancher laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. There were agreements. Arrangements." The woman stepped forward. For months, she had allowed others to speak for her. Not anymore. "There was an agreement," she said. Everyone looked at her. The rancher smiled slightly, believing she was finally admitting he was right. But then she continued. There was an agreement that you would welcome me into your home. His smile faded. There was an agreement that you would treat me with kindness. Silence. There was an agreement that I would be your wife. She looked directly into his eyes. But the moment I arrived, you broke every promise you made. The rancher opened his mouth, but no words came. Because she was right. The woman who stood before him was not the frightened bride he abandoned. She was someone who knew her own worth. You don't get to come back now because you changed your mind, she said. The rancher's face tightened. You think this man can give you a better life? She glanced at the Apache warrior. Then she looked back at the rancher. This man gave me something you never did. The rancher waited. Respect. The word echoed through the quiet land. The Apache warrior said nothing. He didn't need to. This was her moment. The rancher looked uncomfortable, almost angry that the woman he rejected was no longer begging for his acceptance. You'll regret turning away from me, he said. The woman shook her head. No. She looked toward the open land around her. I regret believing I needed you to have a future. The rancher had no answer. Because the truth was standing right in front of him. The woman he discarded had found something he could never take away. Her confidence. Her voice. Her freedom. The riders eventually turned back toward the town, leaving behind the woman they once humiliated. The Apache warrior watched until they disappeared. Then he looked at her. You did not need me to speak for you. She smiled. No. She looked toward him. But I'm grateful you were there when I needed to remember I could speak. The warrior nodded. And in that quiet moment, both understood something important. Their bond was not built from rescue. It was built from choice. And that choice had changed both of their lives forever. The morning sun rose over the wide frontier land, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange. For the first time in a long while, the bride woke up without fear. There was no wagon waiting to take her somewhere she didn't know. No crowd waiting to judge her. No man deciding whether she was worthy. She stepped outside her small home and looked across the land around her. It was not the grand life she once imagined when she read those hopeful letters. But it was real. It was peaceful. And most importantly, it was hers. Months ago, she had arrived in a strange town believing her future depended on whether one man accepted her. Now she understood something far more valuable. Her future had always belonged to her. The Apache warrior stood nearby, preparing for the day. He noticed her watching the sunrise and walked over. You are quiet this morning, he said. She smiled. I was thinking about the day I arrived. The warrior looked toward the distant mountains. The day everything changed. She nodded. I thought losing that marriage meant I had lost everything. And now? She looked around. Now I realize I was losing something I never truly had. The warrior looked at her with quiet understanding. She continued. I spent so much of my life waiting for someone to choose me. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. But I never asked myself if I would choose them. The Apache warrior nodded slowly. That is a question many people never ask. She smiled. And I almost never learned the answer. For a moment, they stood together in comfortable silence. Their relationship had grown slowly. Not from a promise written on paper. Not from an arrangement. Not from desperation. It grew from trust. From conversations beside the fire. From shared struggles. From two people who had both known loneliness and found understanding in each other. Later that afternoon, a visitor arrived. A young rider from the nearby town approached with news. The bride immediately recognized the worried expression on his face. What happened? The rider removed his hat. The rancher has been telling people you were taken against your will. Her expression changed. Even after all this time, he was still trying to control the story. The Apache warrior stepped forward. But before he could speak, she raised her hand. No. The warrior looked at her. She smiled slightly. This time, I speak. The rider looked surprised. The woman who once could barely say a word in front of a crowd now stood with complete confidence. Tell the town the truth, she said. Tell them I left because I was rejected. Tell them I stayed because I chose to. Tell them no one forced me. The rider nodded. And if they don't believe you? She looked toward the open land. Then they don't have to. Her answer surprised him. Because she no longer needed everyone's approval. She only needed to know the truth herself. Days later, she returned to the town. Not as a rejected bride. Not as a woman searching for acceptance. She returned because she wanted to face the place where she had once been broken. The same streets. The same buildings. The same people who had watched her humiliation. But this time, the whispers were different. Some looked ashamed. Some looked impressed. Others simply watched in silence. The rancher stood outside his store when she approached. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly. You really chose this life? She looked around. She saw the land. She saw the people who had become important to her. She saw the person she had become. Yes, she answered. The rancher shook his head. I don't understand. She gave him a calm look. That's because you thought my choice was about choosing another man. She paused. It was never about that. The rancher waited. It was about choosing myself. Those words carried more power than anger ever could. The rancher lowered his eyes. Because he finally understood what he had lost. Not a bride. Not a possession. A person. A woman who had found her own strength. The Apache warrior stood nearby, watching. He had never wanted to own her story. He had only wanted her to have one. As they left the town together, the woman looked back one last time. She remembered the frightened girl who arrived there. The girl who believed rejection meant she had no value. She wished she could go back and tell that girl something. She would tell her. Your worth is not decided by who accepts you. Your future is not decided by who leaves you. Your voice matters. Your choice matters. And sometimes, the greatest beginning comes from the moment you thought everything had ended. Years later, people would still tell the story of the rejected mail-order bride and the Apache warrior who stood in front of a crowd and said, she chooses now. But the truth was even more powerful. He did not give her a choice. She always had one. He simply reminded her that it was hers.